The hush between stars ****, there is a place in the galaxy that every Sci-Fi species agrees not to enter. It has no official name in any alliance register, no coordinates listed on any public chart. The Thrun call it Kavashna, the silence that eats. The Muruk call it the grave of signals. Humans, when they finally heard about it, just called it the hush, because that was the only word that felt honest. Ships that enter the hush do not explode. They do not get boarded by pirates or torn apart by radiation storms. They simply go quiet, engines cut out, sensors return static. Crews report in their final transmissions that the silence inside the hush is not empty, it is listening. And then nothing, no wreckage has ever been found, no survivors have ever been recovered. In 400 years of galactic spacefaring, the hush had swallowed 111 ships from 6 different species, and not one had ever answered a hail again. So when the Thrun Research Fleet Ushtrath, 3 vessels, 206 souls, sent to study the boundary of the hush from what their scientists swore was a safe distance, drifted across an invisible line and stopped unsung, the rest of the galaxy did what it always did. It grieved. It luggered the loss. It updated the warning beacons, and it moved on because the hush did not negotiate, and nothing sent in after a lost ship had ever come back either. Nothing. That is, until the humans showed up and asked why nobody had actually gone to look. Captain Naomi Reyes was 34 years old when she was handed the file on the Ushtrath. She was not a diplomat. She was not a scientist. She commanded a survey vessel called the Kestrel Song, a ship built for exactly one purpose: to go to the places other species had already decided were unknowable, and make a map of them anyway. Humanity had earned its reputation in the Alliance not through weapons or wealth, but through this, the stubborn, faintly embarrassing habit of poking at things everyone else had agreed to leave alone. The Thrun ambassador who briefed her did not want her to go. He said so plainly through the translator, his 4 eyes dimming in the particular way Thrun eyes dumbered when they were trying not to show grief. "We are not asking you to attempt recovery," he said. "We are asking you to update the warning, to confirm what we already know. Please do not mistake this for a rescue mission." "Untested," Naomi said, and signed the transit request anyway, because everyone in that room, including the ambassador, knew that humans did not know how to update a warning without checking first whether the warning was still true. The Kestrel Song left dock 4 days later with a crew of 11. Naomi brought her best pilot, a quiet Korean-Nigerian man named Fumi Alarun, who had never once in 6 years of service failed to bring a ship home. She brought her chief engineer, a broad, laughing woman named Dorota Veskas, who talked to the ship's systems like they were unruly children. She brought a linguist, a xenobiologist, a medic, and 5 others whose names would matter later when the story was told, though at the time they were simply the Kestrel Song crew doing their jobs, flying toward a place that had eaten 111 ships. They did not fly in blind. That was not the human method. For 6 weeks before departure, Naomi's crew had gathered every scrap of data on the hush that existed anywhere in the Alliance archives: sensor logs from ships that had skirted the edge and turned back, spectral analyses, the last transmissions of the lost, played and replayed until the crew could recite them in their sleep. The Thrun scientists called the project thorough. Privately, some of them called it obsessive. They were not wrong. But there was a pattern in that obsession that no other species had thought to look for, because no other species built its science the way humans did: half data, half story, refusing to let the two stay separate. Dorota was the one who noticed it first, 3 weeks into the journey, hunched over a display with her hands full of instant noodles. "Captain," she said, "every single ship's last transmission, every one, they don't say sensors failing. They don't say systems offline. Look at the words." Naomi looked. She had read the transmissions a dozen times, but she had been reading them as data, timestamps, coordinates degrading signal quality. She had not been reading them as what they actually were, the last words of frightened people. And when she read them that way, she saw what Dorota saw. Over and over, across 6 species and 4 centuries, the final transmissions used the same shape of language. It knows we're here, it's asking something. "We don't understand what it wants." They all thought it was trying to communicate, Naomi said slowly. "And every single species that thought that," Dorota said, "sent back more sensors, more probes, more questions phrased in math." She set down her noodles. "Nobody ever just answered it." Kestrel Song reached the boundary of the hush 11 days after leaving dock. From the outside, it did not look like anything. No storm, no nebula, no visible disturbance, just a region of ordinary black space that every instrument agreed was ordinary, right up until the exact point where ships stopped coming back. Naomi gave the order that no captain of any other species had ever given at that boundary. She did not send in a probe. She did not send in a drone. She flew the Kestrel Song in herself, crew and all, at 1/4 impulse, broadcasting on every frequency they had, not a distress call, not a scientific query, but something else entirely, a recording Naomi had made the night before of her own voice, saying simply, "We hear that something is here. We're not afraid. We'd like to know your num." Fummi's hands were steady on the controls. Doruta's were not, but she kept them on the console anyway. The ship crossed the line. For 11 seconds, nothing happened. Then every screen on the bridge went white. What the crew experienced next was never fully agreed upon, even among themselves, even years later when the story had been told 1,000 times in 1,000 different rooms across the Alliance. Some of them described it as sound, a vast, low tone that seemed to come from inside their own skulls rather than through their ears. Others described it as pressure, or grief, or the specific feeling of being looked at by something that had been alone for longer than any single species had existed. Naomi, when she told it, always said it felt like walking into a room where someone has been crying for a very long time, and realizing the someone is the room itself. What every version of the story agreed on was this: it was not an attack. It was a question, repeated across 400 years and 111 ships. A question that no one had ever managed to answer, because every species that heard it had responded with instruments instead of understanding. The question, once the Kestrel Song us linguist Amara Ussa had spent 6 frantic, brilliant hours untangling it with the ship's translation array running hotter than it was rated for, turned out to be almost unbearably. You remember us Asterisk's hush, they would eventually piece together, was not a phenomenon, it was a grave. Somewhere in the deep past, millions of years before any current species had left its homeworld, an entire civilization had existed in that region of space, had built and loved and argued and died, and had, at the very end of its existence, done something none of its neighbors had ever managed. It had folded a fragment of its collective mind into the fabric of the space itself, a vast and dying attempt to leave something behind that would outlast extinction. It had no body left, no ships, no cities. It had only the question, asked over and over into the dark, to every Travolk who wandered close enough to hear it. Does anyone remember that we were Asterisk? And every ship that had entered the hush in 400 years had answered, without meaning to, in the one language that dying, grieving thing could understand least: silence. Fear, retreat. Instruments recording data about a phenomenon, never once addressing the mind behind it. To something that had spent millions of years being forgotten, that silence was not neutral, it was confirmation. Every fleeing ship, every panicked shutdown, every unanswered hail had told the thing in the dark the same thing over and over. No, nobody remembers you, nobody ever will, Asterisk, and so it kept them. Not out of malice, the crew would come to believe, and it was Amara who argued this most fiercely, but because a mind that has been forgotten once will do almost anything rather than be forgotten twice. It held on to the only visitors it had ever had, the only proof it had ever gotten that it still existed at all. "It's not a monster," Amara said, exhausted, 4 days after they'd crossed the boundary, the Kestrel Song somehow still intact, still flying, held in an embrace none of them could see or measure. "It's the loneliest thing that has ever existed, and everyone who ever met it ran. Naomi Reyes did not run. She did the thing that her species had always done, the thing that had made the Thrun ambassador so uneasy about sending humans in the first place, the thing that no dataset, no protocol, no careful diplomatic training had ever quite prepared the rest of the galaxy for. She talked to it like it mattered. She told it about Earth, not the sanitized version given in first contact briefings, not the highlight reel of achievements. She told it about the small things. About cities that got rebuilt after they burned, about songs sung at funerals, so the dead would not be forgotten before their names had even stopped being spoken, about the specific human habit of naming stars after people who were gone, so that some part of them stayed lit up in the sky forever. She told it that humans had spent their entire history being terrified of exactly the thing it was terrified of, and had built their whole civilization, messily and imperfectly, around trying to make sure it never happened. She told it, finally, the 206 names of the Thrun crew still trapped somewhere inside it, because Amara had pulled the Ashtroth's manifest before they'd ever left dock, and Naomi had memorized every one. "Remember them," she said, into the dark, into the vast and grieving quiet. "I didn't know them, but I remember that they were here, and I am not going to stop remembering, whether you let us go or not." Hush did not answer in words. It answered by opening the Kestrel Song, found the Estrus 3 vessels drifting together in a pocket of space that should not have existed, engines dark, life support somehow still running on the barest possible margin, as though something had been keeping 206 people alive out of the same desperate refusal to let go that had trapped them in the first place. When Naomi's crew boarded, they found the Thrun crew alive, thin, frightened, 4 years older than the day they had vanished, though only weeks had passed for the rest of the galaxy, and utterly unable to explain how they had survived at all. They did not fully understand it themselves until much later. But it was Fummy, quiet as always, who put it together first, watching the readings as the Kestrel Song began impossibly to move again, and behind it, one by one, the 6 other lost ships still recoverable inside the Hush's boundary, a Muruk cutter 3 centuries gone, a human colony transport presumed destroyed in humanity's own early spacefaring days, ships from species that no longer even existed to claim them. All of them released. All of them in whatever way a thing without a body could manage, think Asterusk. It wasn't trying to kill anyone, Fummy said. It was trying to make sure that when it finally did let someone go, they'd tell people it had been here. Naomi looked out at the ships drifting free around her, at 206 Thrun faces pressed to viewports, alive against every probability the galaxy had assigned them. So let's tell them, she said. The Hush is still there. It has not vanished, has not been solved, has not been reduced to a footnote in some technical journal, and Naomi Reyes was the first to argue, loudly and often, that it never should be. What changed was not the phenomenon. What changed was the warning beacon at its boundary, which for 400 years had read simply, "Do not enter." No skvavuz, Astrusgut reads differently now. Alliance Council fought about it for months, precedent, protocol, whether it was appropriate to alter a warning beacon based on the testimony of a single human captain and her crew. But in the end, overthrown objections about tone and Muruk objections about the danger of encouraging further attempts. The humans won because the humans, as usual, simply would not stop Ugwong until they did. The beacon at the edge of the Hush now reads, "Someone is here. They are not dangerous. They are alone. If you enter, remember them." Asterusk ships still avoid it mostly. It is still not safe, not truly, not in any way a sane species would call safe. But every few years a human ship goes in anyway, never with weapons, never with probes first, always with a crew willing to talk into the dark and mean it, and every time they come back out. And every time they bring one more name, one more ship, one more handful of people who had been given up on by everyone else in the galaxy, except the one species too stubborn, too sentimental, and too fundamentally incapable of leaving a grieving thing alone in the dark to simply walk away. Naomi Reyes still commands the Kestrel Song Asterusk. She still flies to the places nobody else will go. And when new recruits ask her why humanity keeps sending ships into a graveyard that has already claimed 111 of them, she tells them what she told the thing in the Hush, on the day she flew into a silence that had swallowed a century of ships and refused, simply refused, to let it swallow one more. Asterisk, we remember. That's all it ever wanted. That's the whole trick. That's the only weapon we've ever really needed. Asterisk, we just have to be willing to say it out loud.